Well, it's 7:03, so it's time to get started. Welcome everyone to the discussion of the new documentary, The Story of Plastics. I'm Martha Ainsworth, Chair of the Maryland Sierra Club Zero Waste Team.
Hi, and I'm Josh Tulkin. I'm the Director of the Maryland Chapter of the Sierra Club.
Thank you for viewing The Story of Plastic and for joining us tonight for this discussion. The event was set up specifically to allow members of the General Assembly and local legislators and officials the opportunity to view the film and to ask and get answered important questions from the experts. I'm pleased to say that there are more than 24 members of the General Assembly out here, and some of their staff, and members of county legislatures and environmental departments from around the state. So thank you all for joining. We have 5 distinguished panelists. You're going to hear more about the incredible credentials of these experts shortly and what they've been doing to address this issue. So we're looking forward to hearing your questions and their answers.
Great. And we'll be hearing first from each of the panelists back to back for about 5 minutes each to allow 20 or 25 minutes at the end for questions. So please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom. If we can answer them quickly by typing, we will, and we'll take the rest of them. So let me know who you're trying to direct the question to. As a quick reminder, everybody is starting off muted. So the way to submit your questions is going to be the Q&A, and we're doing that because we have so many panelists that we can't have everyone's video and audio on. But if you have any problems hearing or have any other comments, you can also submit those through the question and answer. And with that, I'll turn it back to Martha.
Okay, thanks, Josh. Well, to launch the discussion, I'd like to share 5 of my personal takeaway messages from The Story of Plastic. Lindsay, okay, great. I've got them on a PowerPoint. All right, first one. I'm really appalled. I'm appalled and angry at this photo. I don't know if that affected you all the way it did me, but it just makes me very angry and very sad. Stuff from the American and European recycling bins that can't be recycled has been shipped all over the world, polluting the land and the sea. A huge environmental injustice. You know, how could this have happened? And I think a lot of people are not aware of this. My second message. Thank you. We've accepted industry's many false narratives, that this is a problem of bad management, that people are responsible, that we can use as much single-use plastic as we want, just so long as we recycle it, and so forth. There are many false narratives highlighted in this film. The third point. Plastic pollution is the end result of fossil fuel extraction used to make single-use throwaway items. As the world moves to renewable energy, there'll be even more frack gas produced for plastics. We have to prepare for, if you can believe it, an even bigger problem. That's possible. The fourth takeaway message. We aren't going to solve the plastic pollution problem by more recycling, more anti-litter campaigns, and more cleanups. If we don't turn off the spigot, there's no hope of ever cleaning it up. We have to stop it at the origin. I love this picture of the bathtub. This is something that stays with you. Go to the next slide, please. This is doing something to turn off the spigot, and I'm surprised that there's nobody there holding a sign about getting rid of the subsidies to the fossil fuel producers. Okay, my fifth message, and the last one, is that we need to minimize waste by re-engineering products and compost or recycle what's left over. Those are the last resorts. We should be reducing first. So the film left me yearning for more answers. Frankly, what works? Where does it work? What's the evidence? Is there anywhere in the world where the spigot has been turned off? What did it take? I'm asking the panelists to help us with some solutions. Give us some hope. Okay, so with that, I will turn it over to Josh to introduce our first speaker, Judith Enck.
Hi, everybody. I'm thrilled to introduce Judith Enck. Judith is a senior fellow and visiting faculty member at Bennington College, and she's the founder and the president of Beyond Plastics. Beyond Plastics works with community leaders on issues related to plastic pollution and trains college students to become informed and active on environmental issues. Judith served from 2009 to 2017 as the Obama administration's regional administrator for the EPA, Region 2, which includes New York, New Jersey, 8 Indian nations, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. She previously was Deputy Director of the Environment in New York Governor's Office and Policy Advisor to the State Attorney General, and a Senior Associate at New York PIRG. Welcome, Judith. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Josh. I really want to thank the Sierra Club for organizing this event. And I want to thank all of the elected officials and their very busy and underpaid staff who are on with us tonight, because I know you've been working night and day on the COVID response, and I deeply appreciate your public service. I think one thing that this crisis that we're all facing together reminds us is that we have to respect science, and we need competence in government. And that is very much linked to the issues of plastic pollution. Plastic pollution is getting worse. The science informs that. And second, we know that hopefully after we get past the immediate health issues, which are paramount to deal with, we are going to have tremendous economic despair in this country, very high unemployment rates. And I think it's time to recognize that the plastics industry needs to take financial responsibility for the massive amount of waste that they produce. They've gotten a free ride for a very long time, expecting taxpayers to foot the bill. As Josh mentioned, I had the privilege of serving in the Obama administration at EPA Region 2. Sorry, I didn't have Maryland in my region. And I knew I would leave office when the president changed. And I had a moment in time to think about, what issue do I want to work on? Where can I really make a difference? And I decided to work on plastic pollution because it touched so many of the issues that I am very concerned about. One is climate change. The other is water quality. It's a waste issue. It's very much an environmental justice issue that we saw illustrated in the story of plastic. If you didn't have time to watch the story of plastic, that is your homework assignment. It is a game changer. It looks at plastic through the lens of human rights, and I urge you to watch it. It was made, by the way, by a nonprofit based in California called The Story of Stuff. And that is a really interesting organization that looks at our overconsumption and the choices that we make. A few quick points on plastics. 9 million metric tons of plastic enter the ocean every year. And I think that's an underestimate. About 80% of it comes from land. It's litter that gets into storm drains, goes to sewage treatment plants, hits rivers and lakes and streams, and ultimately in the ocean. When it gets to the ocean, the sunlight will make the plastic brittle, and the wave action will break the plastic down into hundreds, if not thousands of pieces. You've probably heard the phrase microplastic. That's the size of a grain of sand. Those microplastics are being consumed by marine life and ultimately us. There was just a great cover story in Consumer Reports, How to Eat Less Plastic. And I'm not holding it up because I'm quoted extensively in the article, but I'm holding it up because the front page of Consumer Reports tells us you may be consuming as much as a credit card's worth of plastic every week. Mostly we're breathing it in. We're also drinking it in beverages like bottled water, beer. We know plastic is in salt. It is really in our food chain. For the statistic that really stops me in my tracks, however, is scientists telling us within the next 8 years or so, for every 3 pounds of fish in the ocean, there will be 1 pound of plastic. That is just unconscionable. For many years, we were told just toss your recyclables into the recycling bin and you don't have to worry about it. Well, according to my old bosses at EPA, 8.5% of plastics is recycled, meaning, do the math with me, over 90% of plastics are not recycled. The plastic manufacturers don't want you to know that. They want us to keep spending tax dollars on fundamentally a failed recycling program. Plastics used to be made from oil and toxic chemicals. Now they're made from toxic chemicals and ethane, a byproduct of hydrofracking. And congrats to your state for not allowing hydrofracking to go forward. This is very much a climate change issue if all of the ethane cracker plants that are proposed are built. If they are, it will be the equivalent of carbon emissions emitted from 189 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants. What I think is happening without any discussion with elected officials or the public is the fossil fuel industry recognizes that there's a big increase in renewable energy for electricity, a move toward clean transportation, and they're looking at single-use plastics to be the replacement market for them. I am clearly out of time. There's a lot of good information on our website, beyondplastics.org. Follow us on social media. We are here to be a resource for policymakers and community leaders. Thank you.
Thanks, Judith. I'm now pleased to introduce Susan Collins from the Container Recycling Institute. There she is. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Martha.
Susan Collins has served as the president of the Container Recycling Institute since 2009. The CRI was founded in 1991, and it's become recognized as the expert source for information on container recycling and container deposit systems. Susan leads the Institute's research projects. She works with environmental organizations, businesses, and state and federal governments in the US and around the world to educate the public on the benefits of packaging recycling and the social and environmental impacts of the production and disposal of one-way beverage containers. Prior to 2009, she was a consultant for 20 years and assisted over 80 public agencies with their solid waste and recycling programs. That's really phenomenal. Susan served on 4 Cal Recycle advisory groups, on the board of the California Resource Recovery Association for 9 years, and the board of the National Recycling Coalition since 2010. She holds degrees in manufacturing engineering from Boston University and business administration from UCLA. Susan.
Martha, thank you. And thank you so much to the Maryland Sierra Club for hosting this excellent forum with excellent speakers, all following on the inspiration of the wonderful documentary, wonderful and horrifying documentary, The Story of Plastic. One of the things that we talked about was the need to talk about solutions. And so I'm going to be talking about a very specific solution, the container deposit laws, which is one of the primary areas that our organization works on. Although our mission is to make North America the model for the collection and high quality recycling of packaging materials. And I hope this is actually working because on my end, the video is frozen, but I'm hoping that at least the audio is getting through. So first of all, what are container deposit programs? Container deposit refund programs are those where a consumer purchases a beverage and they also pay a small deposit of 5 or 10 cents. And they receive that refund back, the same amount, when they return their beverage container for recycling. And the history of container deposit laws is that the first one was passed 50 years ago in 1970 in British Columbia, Canada. And that program is still going strong today and has innovated along the way over these 50 years. So since that time, container deposit laws have spread around the world and they now exist in 60 states, provinces, or countries. The recent growth, however, has been really astounding, and a lot of it comes from the issue of beverage container litter and many of the statistics that Judith talked about in terms of plastic litter that ends up in the ocean. So there's been so much interest in finding solutions to that plastic litter problem that container deposit laws have become more popular than ever. So when I say more popular than ever, I mean they've doubled in the last 3 years. At the beginning of 2017, container deposit laws covered 300 million people worldwide. And in the last 3 years, new laws have been passed that would cover another 300 million people worldwide. And we're already seeing additional countries either talk about or do studies or have precursor laws on the books that make us realize that in the next few years, we're actually going to hit 1 billion people worldwide with container deposit laws. There's also been tremendous interest in the last year in the United States. In 2019, 9 different states introduced a bill for a container deposit law, and they discussed it. They didn't pass it, but that was the most we'd ever seen, 9 states. In addition to that, there was not just one national container deposit bill introduced, but actually 2 of them introduced in February of this year. So here in the US, only 10 states currently have a container deposit law, but these programs are so powerful that 50% of all of the beverage containers that are captured for recycling in the United States come from those 10 programs. PET plastic, like soda and water bottles, have an overall recycling rate of less than 30% in the US. However, that average rate really obscures the true story. The real story is there's sort of 2 different programs, and the containers that are on deposit have a nearly 60% recycling rate, while the containers not on deposit have only a 14% recycling rate. So when it comes to PET plastic, like soda bottles and water bottles, the container deposit laws are 4 times more powerful than the places that don't have deposit laws. So clearly we need more state-by-state container deposit laws, and ultimately we really need a strong national container deposit law. We should have this kind of powerful law in place nationwide. If we had a 10-cent deposit law, we could increase our beverage container recycling rate in the US from 30% up to 85%, which our star performers in Oregon and Michigan are already achieving that level. So we know it's possible. And the benefits from that in this time of so much unemployment, one of the benefits would be that a national container deposit law would support 90,000 jobs nationally. It would also recover materials worth more than $1 billion. It would save enough energy to power 2 million homes, and it would cut beverage container litter in half. And really, that's why our whole organization was founded in the first place back in 1991. It was because a group of citizens were just incensed about the amount of beverage container litter and wanted to do something about it. So the other piece of this that we also need desperately at this time is laws requiring minimum recycled content, because with oil prices being so low, the big brands that have made commitments toward using more recycled content are going to be economically tempted to use virgin content instead, because it's going to be so much cheaper than recycled content. So we're going to need legislation to hold those big brands to their promises. And so with that, I thank you again, Maryland Sierra Club, and I turn it back to you.
Susan Collins, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to introduce Melanie Duchin. Melanie is a Greenpeace plastics campaigner who's based in the San Francisco Bay Area. She started working for Greenpeace in the early 1990s and has campaigned on a broad range of issues from ozone depletion, remember the ozone hole, and climate change to toxic oceans and forests. For several years, she was based in Anchorage, Alaska, where she focused on the impacts of climate change in the Arctic and worked to stop oil companies from drilling in what they viewed as the new frontier for oil exploration. Melanie recently moved to Berkeley, California to focus on the issue of plastic pollution, bringing years of effective campaigning experience to this critical issue. In addition to her issue-based work on this, she has logged many miles on Greenpeace ships, including the expeditions to the Arctic, Antarctica, and the Marshall Islands. And as somebody who spent a very, very seasick week on the Arctic sunrise, I very much appreciate the time you put in on those ships. And thank you so much, Melanie, for joining us tonight.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Martha, thank you, Josh, and thank you to the Sierra Club for organizing this panel discussion on the story of plastic. Now, let me start out by saying that I'm not an expert on plastics. I've only been working on the issue for about 3 months. However, I have worked for Greenpeace for a couple of decades on the issues, as Josh said, of ozone depletion, toxics, and climate change. And what I've seen is a pattern to all these issues, and we see this pattern in the story of plastic and with the issue of plastic as well. In the face of an overwhelming body of scientific evidence linking their product with significant risks to human health and the environment, corporations run campaigns to confuse the science. They tout the benefits of their product as a way to draw public attention away from the hazards. They fight regulation tooth and nail, and all the while they create new markets for their product, ramping up production in the United States and overseas. It's a pattern of corporate intentionality. And it's this corporate intentionality that makes it particularly insidious. The solution in these cases is to address the problem at its source rather than try to control the problem once it's been created. And legislation that eliminates single-use plastics does just that. I want to spend the rest of my time talking about plastics recycling. As we saw in the film, we can't recycle our way out of the plastic pollution crisis. The plastic industry has known this for decades. There are internal plastic industry memos from the 70s and the 80s that show they knew way back then that recycling wasn't going to work, yet they spent millions selling recycling in order to sell more plastic. They've been intentionally pushing recycling for decades because that narrative allows them to produce more and more plastic. I want to turn now to one aspect of plastic recycling, and that's the false and misleading labels on just about every piece of single-use plastic. I'm talking about the triangle of chasing arrows, the recycling symbol with a number from 1 to 7 inside that identifies the type of plastic, the container, or whatever the piece of plastic is, what it's made out of. We see them everywhere on soda bottles, margarine tubs, coffee cup lids, shampoo bottles, et cetera, et cetera. These labels are designed to make us think it's okay to buy these products because they can be recycled. That's so long as we rinse them out, put them in the right bin, then it's a win for the environment, right? Well, unfortunately, no. In February, Greenpeace released a report that surveyed the nation's 367 materials recovery facilities, or MRFs. Our survey found that only plastics labeled PET number 1 and HDPE number 2, those are plastic bottles and jugs, can be labeled as recyclable under FTC guidelines. We found that all other plastics labeled from 3 through 7, cannot be labeled as recyclable according to FTC guidelines. Why? Very few MRFs even accept them in the first place. Second, they're worth very little or even have a negative value, so oftentimes MRFs have to pay to have them hauled away. And last, there's little to no processing capacity for them in the United States. They can't be turned into anything else. And as a result, these common plastic pollution items like plastic tubs, cups, lids, plates, and trays wind up landfilled, burned, or in the ocean. As for the phrase check locally that we often see along with the recycling symbol on pieces of throwaway plastic, it's misleading because a consumer can't check locally to determine if their collected plastics will actually be recycled. Consumers can only look on their city or waste hauler's website to see if an item is collected. That's all they can see, is if it's collected. What they can't check is whether that item goes from the sortation facility to a landfill, an incinerator, or is exported where it could wind up in a dump or an incinerator or littered overseas. Our survey found widespread nationwide evidence that where plastics number 3 through 7 are still collected, they're not recycled. Instead, they're landfilled, incinerated or littered here, or they're exported overseas to do the same thing in someone else's backyard. There's a lot more detail in our report. It's called Circular Claims Fall Flat. It's included in the list of materials for your review. I'd also like to be a resource for you folks as you move forward. Thanks so much for your time today and for your interest in efforts to eliminate single-use plastic. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Melanie. That was great. I'm going to introduce now John Hite. There he is. Hi, John. John Hite is a policy analyst with the Zero Waste Project at the Conservation Law Foundation. CLF is a nonprofit, member-supported regional organization working to conserve natural resources, protect public health, and promote thriving communities in the New England region. CLF's Zero Waste Project aims to protect the region's communities from the dangers posed by landfills and incinerators, support the development of a circular economy, and reduce unsafe and unsustainable plastic use and waste disposal. Based out of Boston, John acts as a regional zero waste resource for municipalities and citizen groups in New England, while collaborating on the development and implementation of innovative waste management programs. He's also an advocate for the Zero Waste Project's legislative priorities in Maine and in Massachusetts, including statewide bans on single-use plastics. John, your thoughts?
Hi, Martha. Thanks so much. And thanks, Josh, and everyone else at the Maryland Sierra Club for organizing this. This is fantastic. I'm especially glad to be on as I've got some Maryland roots. My dad grew up in Cumberland, and my granny, when she heard about the panel, said to say hello to Senator Edwards if he's listening. I'd like to build a little bit more on the points that Melanie brought up around why recycling is not the solution to the plastic problem, the impact that that's having on our local government, and another policy idea that fits in with some of the others that you've heard about tonight that can help shift this system around. As you heard from Melanie, our recycling system is not built on what is technically recyclable. Technically, you could take almost any plastic into a lab and you could break it down and turn it into its constituent parts again. But that's not feasible, and that's not how our system operates. Our system is built on what can be sold as value. And as Melanie pointed out, that is a losing game and has been from the get-go. The impact of China's national sword in 2018, with them shutting down imports of single-use plastics that we were sending their way, has really done a number on our local recycling programs. Boston, for instance, saw their contract swing from at most $35 a ton to over $3 million. Over 70 towns in Western Massachusetts were making about $8 a ton on their single stream recycling. Now under a new contract that started in January, they're paying up to $145 a ton. That is absolutely unsustainable for a local government. It just is. And there are a lot of local governments that are considering getting rid of their programs. The number one solution that's been put forward by the recycling companies so far is to educate. If municipalities did a better job of educating their residents, then this problem would magically disappear and their costs would go down. But that's not really a solution when you dig at it. Education really just means we're taking non-recyclable plastic from our recycling container and we're putting it in our trash container. Well, our trash container then inevitably has to wind up at the landfill, which costs tipping fees, and that comes out of taxpayer funds too. Municipalities really are screwed. They're stuck in the middle. They can't change the markets downstream. And they really don't have much control over product design or what comes into their communities in the first place. One of the solutions that fits well with the bottle bills, the container deposit laws that Susan was talking about, as well as the minimum recycled content laws and the bans, another policy in the mix is an idea that was alluded to in the story of plastic film. This is an idea called extended producer responsibility, or EPR. I know that sounds like a bunch of policy wonk jargon, and it totally is, but simply put, EPR is the idea that rather than having municipalities who have very little control over the recycling system system fund and manage our recycling programs, we need to hand that cost back to the folks who are making this stuff in the first place. EPR laws require that brand owners or product manufacturers or whoever is putting packaging out on the market either fund directly or provide funding for municipal reimbursement for all of the packaging that they're selling. This has three primary benefits. The first is that it lifts a tremendous burden off of our local governments. Right now, we are all critically aware of how burdened local towns and cities are with this coronavirus pandemic. They can't handle the added burden of paying the outsized cost to try and manage a failing recycling system. We need to lift that cost off of them. Second, EPR for packaging provides a steady and reliable funding stream from multi-billion-dollar international companies to make sure that our recycling, where we're still able to recycle, functions. And third, and I think this is most important to the system change idea, EPR, by handing costs back to companies, requires them to grapple with not only the environmental, but the financial impact that their packaging has. If a company is using packaging that is not easily recyclable and therefore costs a significant amount of money, that's a cost they have to justify to their shareholders during their quarterly stakeholder meetings. And evidence that we've seen from other countries where this has started, France in particular, we've begun to see these, products change and companies change what they're putting on the market. EPR has already taken off around the world. In the EU, Israel, Brazil, Russia, 5 Canadian provinces have EPR for packaging programs. Here in the US, Conservation Law Foundation was part of a campaign both in Massachusetts and Maine to pass EPR bills. In Maine, we were just within a hair of passing the very first EPR for packaging bill in the country. Unfortunately, we had the untimely intervention of COVID-19 this past winter. But this is an idea that is taking off. Legislatures around the country in Connecticut, Illinois, California, Oregon, Washington State are all considering extended producer responsibility for packaging legislation. And we really won't start solving this problem until we hand the costs back to the folks who are putting this stuff on the market in the first place. And I'm happy to answer questions about EPR or chat offline as well with anyone who's interested in some sample legislation. Thank you so much.
John, thank you so much for joining. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Delegate Brooke Lehrman. She's in her second term in the Maryland House of Delegates, representing Maryland's 46th Legislative District in Baltimore. Delegate Lierman serves on the House Environment and Transportation Committee, where she is chair of the Land Use and Ethics Subcommittee. And she has been an active champion on many environmental issues in Maryland. She sponsored the statewide ban on expanded polystyrene foam food containers, which will go into effect this July. And this last year, she led the campaign in the House of Delegates for the passage of the Plastic and Packaging Reduction Act, which would have banned plastic carryout bags and require retailers to charge for other carryout bags. Delegate Lehrman is also a practicing civil rights attorney. She graduated from Dartmouth College. She has attended the University of Texas School of Law. And prior to law school, she served at AmeriCorps Vista, member of the DREAM program in Burlington, Vermont. In 2017, she was named the Green Legislative Champion by the Maryland League of Conservation Voters. Delegate Lehrman, thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to turn it over to you, and please tell us what your reflections are on the film as a legislator.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me tonight. It's great to be with all of you. I want to also recognize that many of my colleagues are on today, and including, I was a sponsor of the ban on foam food packaging, along with my colleague, Senator Cheryl Kagan. This year I worked with Senator Malcolm Augustine on the plastic bag ban. There's been some talk about bottle deposits. Well, we're lucky to have Delegate Sarah Love on the call tonight, who is the primary sponsor of the bottle deposit bill in Maryland, and a number of other colleagues. I know, great to see their names in the Zoom attendee panel, Dana Stein, Ron Watson, Eric Ebersol, Jess Feldmark, Regina Boyce, Shanika Henson, Sarah Love, Kathy Forbes, and also wonderful to see council members Daniel Glarosin, Kay Hagan. Thanks for joining. Kai Hagan, thanks for joining. And so, yeah, I am delighted to be here today. I watched the movie this week. And it was one of those movies where I knew I needed to watch it, but I didn't want to watch it because I knew it was going to be a painful thing to watch, and it was. But I think, a couple reflections that I want to share. And I do want to echo some of the points that have been made already because I think they're really important. Is that, first, we have in the Maryland General Assembly, and I think, I do this and others do this, we have focused on this as a litter problem. And it is. This is a litter problem. But because of that, I think it's some of the more compelling testimony that's come up in the past few years. And I think almost every year I've been in office, I've had some sort of plastic bill. And so I see this happen a lot. But some of our most compelling testimony is from public works departments. It's local governments coming into the General Assembly and saying, please save us. We are drowning and we can't afford to keep doing this. And I think that that is really important. And I think that it should be louder and more central moving forward because of the weight of COVID and the amount of debt that our budgets are, that our local governments are now looking at. I think we need our mayors and our county executives also to be working with our public works departments and coming to the legislature to say, look, we have to cut costs. This is one of the prime areas that we can cut costs. Please start eliminating some of these products because we cannot keep cleaning them up. So I think that, when we talk about litter, we should be talking about how we manage it and from a cost perspective and a pragmatic perspective as well moving forward. I think that's important to keep in mind. But I also think it's important to move on from just framing it as a litter issue and think about it as what it is. And what the movie really makes clear is that this is that single-use plastics are being created because there's so much excess fossil fuels, not because consumers want them. And I would argue that consumers actually don't want things in plastic, but everything that we used to buy in aluminum or paper or cardboard or glass is now in plastic, and we really have very little choice. And even worse, it's in mixed plastics, so it's not even recyclable because one container will have 3 different kinds of plastic on it, and so you can't recycle it. So I think that it's important to recognize that this is really about fossil fuels, and we should be talking about plastics in the same way that we talk about moving away from coal-fired power plants, and we should have the same strong, component, members of our team talking about this as when we talk about fracking, right? If you don't like fracking, then you shouldn't like single-use plastics. And third, I think it's important in the film, it seems like such a massive problem, and it is a massive problem, but it's also a really new problem. And I remember talking to an older gentleman after one of the first bill hearings I had that on the foam ban, so a long time ago, like 5 years ago, not that long, I guess, about plastics. And he looked at me and he said, the thing is, like, this stuff just wasn't a problem when I was growing up. And the truth is that it wasn't a problem when I was growing up either. It wasn't a problem when any of us were growing up because of all the plastics that ever been created, more than half was produced in the last 15 years. And so this is a new problem. And, I think that helps because it reminds us and it should remind legislators that it doesn't have to be this way. We have survived very well without this, and we can survive in the future without it. Finally, I'll just end by saying that I think that in Maryland, what we've been doing is a very gradual approach. We've been doing this on a product by product basis. First was foam. Now I was very pleased, really thrilled that we were able to pass the plastic bag ban out of the House this year. It didn't pass out of the Senate, but we came very close. But I think what I would like to see is to tackle this on a more comprehensive way. I believe we need a comprehensive framework to address the pollution and waste crisis more general. I think we should look at EPR. I think we should look at some of the more circular economy type measures that have gone into place in Europe and in California, requiring manufacturers and retailers to design their packaging to reduce unnecessary waste and improve recyclability or compostability of the package. So I think that we need to start thinking about this in a more comprehensive way as well, not just product by product. But thank you so much for having me here today. It's great to be working with all of you on this incredibly important issue. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Brooke, for those thoughts.
Sure.
So I guess you're queuing up your bills for next year.
Yes.
Already. I hope there are a lot of co-sponsors on this call.
I'm sure. I feel like the people on this call are the most likely to co-sponsor. They are here on this call.
That's great. We've had a couple questions come in while people were talking, and let me just, this is for Susan Collins. Delegate Stein asks, how do you overcome the concerns of county recycling programs to the container deposit laws? That was a bit of a hurdle here when we were trying to promote it with you. You're on mute.
Sorry to have
Okay,
done
go
that.
ahead. Yeah.
It's a question we get asked a lot, and we answer that question with information. First of all, it's always been the case that it costs money for the beverage or for the municipalities to handle all of the beverage containers. Some of the beverage containers are in the trash, some of them are in the recycling, and the public works departments have to do a tremendous job to collect all of that stuff and pay for processing and pay for disposal. And also the portion that's in litter, that's costly as well. So this issue has been studied in academic studies and consultant reports more than 24 times around the world. The costs far, far outweigh the revenues that, you know, the little bit, they don't call them scrap prices for nothing, right? The little bit of scraps that you get in revenue when you can actually sell the materials. So once municipalities understand the full cost, do full cost accounting, they understand that it's really a win for them if they can unload these materials and make them the responsibility of the beverage producers.
Great, thank you. This one is for Melanie. What are the unique political and legal challenges to passing more aggressive plastics legislation in the US, and how do we overcome them? That was for Melanie.
That's a really great question. As some of the other folks have spoken about, plastics is a nexus for a lot of issues. It's not just a waste issue. It's also a climate issue. It's a toxics issue. It's an environmental justice issue, but it's also a democratic issue. And by that, I mean, the plastics industry is working very hard to pass preemption laws. They're trying to take our democratic right to organize and create bans against things like plastic that are bad for our health and bad for our environment. And I think that the plastic industry oftentimes are fueled by Coke industry money, a lot of the same stuff that's going on with the fossil fuel industry. They're actually working very diligently to try to ban our ability to ban these plastics. I would say that's the single biggest challenge legally for banning plastics.
And Martha, if I could just get in on this, Beyond Plastics has a model local law that you could do at the local or state level called the Plastics Trifecta, which bans polystyrene, bans plastic bags, puts a fee on paper bags, and plastic straws and utensils only upon request. That last element is key as more and more people get takeout food, and that would be a good standalone bill for local governments or delegates. So I have the privilege of schlepping around to lots of public hearings late at night. It's actually my favorite thing. I love going to public hearings. It's democracy in action. And I am astonished at opposition from the American Chemistry Council and other plastic companies who show up in tiny little communities to oppose plastic bag bans, polystyrene bans. They usually take the podium and say, I just flew in from Washington. which makes the whole audience giggle. And then they use this 1980s argument that you shouldn't ban polystyrene, you should just recycle it, as if we are idiots. I am so proud when local governments do their own research and see through this, but to be honest, the political influence of the petrochemical industry is huge. And it's not just lobbying expenses, it's also campaign contributions and then setting up false choices between jobs and the environment. And I think we've got to recognize that. And Greenpeace has a really good research brief out on how the plastics industry is exploiting the COVID-19 crisis. It's worth reading. I spend a couple hours every day talking to reporters, explaining that there's no evidence, for instance, linking COVID-19 to reusable bags. So we're just up against a pretty ferocious lobbying force, and all we have on our side is the facts.
Could I add something?
Sure.
Thanks. I just want to jump in to talk for a minute about, because I just got a question about this to my cell phone too, about, would I agree that COVID will dramatically increase the use of plastic because of sanitary concerns? And I have a couple things to say about this. And one is that I think that we should not buy into that narrative. First and foremost, because it ignores the effects of the creation of plastic that are in largely Black and brown communities where these plants exist that are causing horrible pre-existing conditions that make coronavirus so deadly, right? If you grow up next to a plant that is making plastic pellets and you get COVID, you are much more likely to die. And the people who live near those plants are in, these are under-resourced neighborhoods. They're largely African-American and Latino, as we saw in the movie, right? So there is a huge social justice component that we haven't talked about yet. But I think that the whole idea of plastic is, when you think about, oh, it's more sanitary, which it's not, that's just one component. Second is just, looking at the facts, making sure that people understand that there is not, that just because something's plastic doesn't mean it's healthier, right? Paper bags, whatever it is, whether you're bringing your cloth bag, there's no evidence or data that shows that. And third, I will say that public works departments are gonna need to stand up and say, if there's going to be a massive increase in plastic and single-use waste, like, hi, where's that money going to come from to pay for the trash? So I just think there are, for all the reasons that I started first and more, it's so imperative that everybody on this call push it back against that, because it's just wrong, and it's the wrong framing.
Thank you, Brooke.
Jump in on that.
Thank you so much. Martha, did you want me to jump in with a couple questions?
Yeah, why don't you pick up on a couple?
Wonderful. Well, first I did want to take a second to also recognize Delegate Nicole Williams from District 22 who's joined, and if there's any other elected officials, please let us know in the chat. And thank you so much to all of the elected officials for joining tonight. We're so glad to have you in this conversation. I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Shruti, the chair of the Montgomery County Sierra Club, and Martha Ainsworth, and everybody who worked to convince Montgomery County to not put a pause on its bag fee during this crisis, and help to educate the elected officials on the fact that there is not any science currently backing up increased risk related to using reusable bags, and allowing us to stay strong on the progress that we have made. But I wanted to read a question from Delegate Regina Boyce. Can the panelists please speak to the bigger issue, how this affects Black and brown communities globally as well as rural areas? And I wanted to add on to that, the film really highlighted a lot of this environmental justice aspects of the plastic industry that is not the dominant message we hear in the US. So do you have any advice for us on how we can lift up this justice aspect of the issue, which often comes in second behind the environmental message? I'm going to open this up to the first two panelists who wish to speak on it, but not all five.
Well, as the delegate said, you have to look at the whole life cycle process. Where are plastics made? And it's, you look at Cancer Alley in Louisiana and Mississippi. You look all over the country. There are many small plastic companies. I've done a lot of work on, when I was at EPA and continue to, on PFOA contamination in drinking water. That's from many plastic facilities. Your zip code dictates your health status. And we see ethane cracker facilities proposed in low-income communities of color because that's where the little mom and pop companies like ExxonMobil and Shell think they'll have the path of least resistance. Also, local, tax incentives are offered. In Pennsylvania, there is massive state taxpayer subsidy for ethane crackers. And ironically, while these crackers create a lot of construction jobs, once the facility is built, there are not that many jobs created. It's a few dozen. I think the key thing, if you're going to be giving out government subsidies, is you should support a worker transition. How do we get workers who ordinarily would be working in these plants, often in hazardous conditions? How do we have a just transition? And from a taxpayer perspective, that's a lot cheaper than bailing out fossil fuel companies and subsidizing plastic manufacturing.
I think I'd like to add that it's really important to have those voices at all our conversations. I mean, we don't tonight, but in our bill hearing this year, we had people who live, we all the delegates and senators on this call, like, we represent diverse communities, and we see when we go into communities that are more resourced and that are often Black and brown communities, that they have more litter, there's more trash, the air is dirtier, right? And so at least in my district, we have a really strong zero waste group who came to Annapolis to say, this really matters to us. This is our community and we want it cleaner. And so I think it's really important to have people's voices at the table who are being affected really negatively. Their lives are being negatively affected on a daily basis. Their kids are growing up seeing trash just as a regular occurrence, just like it's supposed to be there, which it's not. So I think making sure that we engage affected communities in the lobbying and in these discussions and in every step along the way is really important because we're trying to do this for the good of the entire world, but some people are being more negatively affected by this waste than others. And so we have to keep that in mind.
Thank you. We have several questions about extended producer responsibility. Amy Marin asks on, is it Hite or Hite? Hite. Either way, Hite, sorry. How did Maine's extended producer responsibility legislation advance so far, and what advice do you have to promote this in Maryland? And if you could tell us a little bit about what Maine's legislation was and any lessons I might be able to learn from it.
Absolutely. And just if I might quickly build off of Delegate Lierman and Judith's points to the environmental justice impacts, I would just also add in incineration. Burning plastic is another major source of pollution and environmental and public health detriment to largely Black, brown, and immigrant communities. In Massachusetts, 6 out of 7 incinerators, which is the primary way that we dispose of our waste up here, are located in environmental justice communities. So the whole life cycle, all the way from production to disposal, is a problem. As far as the Maine campaign and the Maine EPR bill goes, I saw another person mention in the Q&A formal resolutions. Involving local government in state legislation is key. Unlike bag bans, unlike a lot of other smaller plastics campaigns or plastics policies that we could put in place, we can't go town by town and pass an EPR law town by town. It just doesn't work like that. We can't do the same thing with container deposit laws either. Those really need to be passed at the state level. And I think the most success that we had in Maine was involving and letting local government know that this is not a burden they should be carrying on their own. That, you know, the increased costs that they were looking at and having to figure out how to shift around their budgets away from public safety, away from their schools and towards recycling wasn't right and wasn't something that they should have to bear on their own. In particular, our partner up there, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, Sarah Nichols, in particular, spent a lot of time with local government, educating them, speaking before local boards, and getting formal resolutions passed. And those voices, when they're combined and when they show up at a state house together, carry a lot of weight counter to these industries. I've been at a lot of the hearings for bills in Massachusetts where we haven't gotten as many local folks into the room, and it's industry. It's who's paid to be there. And it's industry versus a couple environmental groups. But this, you know, the cost of recycling and the burdens that plastic is placing on local government really are just too much, and we need to be getting people involved. So I would say formal resolutions are really huge. The other one, if I might quickly add, is just dispelling myths and making sure that local government knows the facts. One of the biggest is that, you know, industry comes in and says that extended producer responsibility laws, container deposit laws, they're going to raise the cost of your products. If we pass these laws, it's going to raise it's going to cost you money in the grocery store. And I think we've had a lot of success educating local governments on the fact that, look, you're paying for it already. You're paying for it right now out of your property taxes. And if we put these laws in place, you know, they've done studies in other places, in other countries in Europe, especially, where, you know, you'll save as a family on average 4 times as much as you'll spend in any increase in grocery costs. So, you know, just making sure that the facts are on the table and that local government is involved.
Great advice there. I have another question here. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any specific examples of where requiring producers to assume the cost of disposal has created an impetus to redesign products?
I guess I can jump in on that one. So far, as far as official studies go, France is the first. Extended producer responsibility laws in their first generation, I'll call them, from the late 90s into the 2000s, primarily operated as a funding mechanism. They required companies to pay in to fund recycling programs. Generation 2 extended producer responsibility laws that are coming online now include an idea called design for environment. So they place a higher cost on companies that use materials that can't be easily recycled, and they give a break to companies that use materials that can be easily recycled. And as these policy changes have gone into effect in Europe in particular, and the EU actually passed a blanket resolution across the entirety of the EU that requires all countries to adopt this policy change, we are starting to see product design change.
I think the best and earliest example of EPR is the bottle bill. And maybe Susan can talk a little bit about how it's designed in Oregon, where we're seeing much more refillable containers. And while I totally support an important federal bill called the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which I hope all the elected officials will take a look at. It's not only a really good federal bill, but there are pieces of it that you can develop into state bills. It's a national bottle bill, it's EPR, it's various consumer plastic bans like we have on the books in the EU. It's sponsored by House Member Lowenthal and Senator Udall, and I'll type in the bill numbers. But a national bottle bill is needed. It's not going to happen tomorrow, given our political climate in Washington. So we really need another state to step forward with a state bottle bill. And I hope out of tonight this might be a little caffeinating of a Maryland bottle bill effort. But Susan, you know bottle bills better than anyone. Could you talk about refillables?
Yeah, I'll definitely take your cue and touch on a couple of things that you mentioned there. First of all, I too very much highly commend the Udall-Lowenthal effort. They engaged more than 200 stakeholders in writing that bill. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, the first bottle bill was passed in 1970 in British Columbia, and that particular one has been updated along the way, and they've brought innovation into the bill. But a bunch of the bottle bills that exist in the United States haven't been keeping up with the times. They haven't gone back and revised them. They haven't, gone back in and added best practices. So the Udall-Lowenthal bill really tried to get around that and said, what do we need to do to bring this up to the current date? And how do we make this the best bill we can? And they really tried to address the concerns of 200 people. And they did include the concept of refillables in that bill. I would say that in both British Columbia and in Oregon, the stewardship organization, which is the co-op that was formed by all the beverage producers, that particular stewardship organization has a strong spirit of continuous improvement, and they wanted to design a refillable program in a new way that could help more beverage makers and even small beverage makers participate. And they did something so innovative that it absolutely flipped the script on what the barrier was to using refillable bottles. And that barrier is that you have to buy and hold this inventory of all these refillable bottles. And in Oregon, they said, hey, we can change that around. We, as the co-op, will purchase all of the containers, and you as small craft brewers, you just rent them from us. And it made it very possible for the small organizations or the small craft brewers and winemakers to jump in on that. And they made a special bottle that's an Oregon bottle, and so the consumers love it. It gives them a sense of pride in their state. The other state that I want to mention, or the other province I want to mention, is again British Columbia. Their legislation was written in a certain way, but one of the key elements of their legislation that has made it get better and better every year is that they wrote continuous improvement into the law, and they wrote the pollution prevention hierarchy into the law. So the beverage producers have a stewardship organization where they need to write a new plan every 5 years, and the plan has to be approved by the province. So every 5 years, and every year with the annual report, essentially the province is asking the beverage producers, what have you done this year to improve the environmental performance of your containers? What have you done this year to improve the efficiency of the whole program? So it's not static, and it is constantly striving to be the best, constantly striving to have the best environmental performance it can.
Very good. We have a follow-up question for you, Susan. Delegate Stein asks, how do you get over, when you're trying to get a bottle bill enacted, how do you get over the opposition of the MRFs who fear their loss of revenue from aluminum as like the main profitable, economically, profitable commodity? How do you get over that? Because that actually was a big problem here.
It is a hurdle, and I call it MRF myopia. We have a tendency to think that MRFs are the center of recycling, and that the way that we're handling recyclables is the way that it needs to be. And I know for sure that the general way that we handle curbside recycling programs in the United States is not the best. As a matter of fact, it's all of the other industrialized countries are doing things better than we are. And we shouldn't let the tail wag the dog, because we're ending up with worse outcomes, both financially and environmentally. We are actually only recycling between 11 and 12 million tons a year in curbside recycling. And if we had a national container deposit law, the size of that program would be 13 million tons a year. So we've put just way too much effort into trying to prop up a piece of the system that's really sort of working against itself. If we take the beverage containers out of the system, out of the curbside system, all of the other materials that are left in the curbside system are going to be cleaner. Most of our curbside recycling programs take perfectly good recyclable material at the curb, and then they throw it all together in a truck, and they instantly have the various materials cross-contaminate each other. And we end up taking material that would have been valuable had it not been crushed and cross-contaminated, and we make it less valuable than it should be. So we can't double down on that bad thinking. We need to rethink the entire system and fix it for everybody across the entire supply chain of recycling.
I have a question, one more question, and then I'm going to turn it over to Josh to ask a few. How are we doing time? The movie, this is for everyone, the movie pushes the reality that gradual change is not really sufficient to get the job done. But how do we get an EPR bill that's passed that's more sweeping, more systemic? Who would like to take that one?
I've been asking myself that question my whole life. Incremental change versus swinging, you know, for the home run. But I think John Hite can answer that since it's EPR related.
It is. You know, first off, I think there's a moment right now. There's a lot of attention from two directions on the plastic problem. There's the attention on the dangers to the environment and health. And I think the general public is really becoming aware of that. And that is being met in meeting with higher municipal cost for recycling. And those two have created this perfect storm at the moment to really elevate both the dangers and the expense of plastic. I think the more that we can involve local government, as I said, in this campaign, the better. And so, you know, rather than just calling state or federal legislators, call your local government, county, town, city, let them know that you want to see some sort of vocal support. Our experience in New England has been that that draws a lot of attention at the state level. And I would say part of this too is bringing these policies together to the point that Susan, the question that Susan was answering about aluminum undercutting municipal recycling. If we pass a bottle bill at the same time that we pass EPR for packaging, at the same time that we pass a number of bans, it's a big ask. But if we bring that together as a package, those all work in tandem and reinforce each other and help each other. And I think sort of presenting the solution as a package instead of having these one-off policies can really help.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, we attempted in our plastic bag ban bill to include a work group that would have, well, my goal for the work group was for it to recommend a comprehensive system, including EPR. But the work group was stripped out of the bill when it was passed. Maryland passed work groups to get, you know, legislator buy-in and to study ideas and stuff sometimes before passing big initiatives. But I think at the end of the day, we sort of just have to do it all and put it out there and start, you know, examining it and challenging people, you know, to step up. I do think that the local government issue is really important. And, you know, we were really able to pass the phone ban because so many local governments started passing it. And I think the more local governments that pass plastic bag bans and the more local governments that start things, these other bills look at, you know, on plastic waste, the easier it is for state legislators to come in and pass things because they're like, oh, look, you already did it there. You know, we might as well pass it. And frankly, it makes manufacturers and grocery stores who have, you know, multiple locations around the state come in and say, can you just please pass one bill at the state level so that, you know, not every Safeway doesn't operate under a different set of laws. So I think that I agree with John. It's really important to be moving at the local level as well. Even if it's like a small town, you know, I mean, just start somewhere. That's the advice I give to everybody. People who call me from like Arizona and ask how to pass a phone ban, I'm like, how big is your town? Try starting at your town. You know, I mean, you got to start somewhere.
Thanks. Josh, do you want to pull up one last question? We're reaching our limit.
Martha, I think we're, I'm happy to, but I'm also happy to turn it back to you. I know you wanted to switch over at 8:10. But I will, if you'd like me to ask one, I do have one pulled up.
Okay.
Kathy Michaels asked, the film doesn't really mention or discuss cracker plants, but one of the panelists did mention cracker plants. If we could turn this to Judith, could you tell us what cracker plants are? And if you can speak at all to the development of cracker plants in the Ohio River Valley, what's going on?
Sure. Yeah, so envision a hydrofracking well pad. And today, most of the ethane, which is a byproduct from fracking, is vented into the atmosphere. There are now plans to build pipelines that would capture the ethane and send it to these new plastic manufacturing plants called ethane crackers. And it's a weird name, but basically they heat the ethane to very high temperature, they turn it into ethylene, and it becomes the building block, the main ingredient for single-use plastic packaging. It doesn't work unless you've got local fracking operations. So facilities are proposed in Pennsylvania, the Ohio Valley, West Virginia, and also in the Gulf Coast. So as of this past February, there were 343 new facilities like this proposed or expanded facilities. I said earlier, these are major carbon emitters. These are super carbon emitters. They also emit a lot of air toxics, particularly benzene, and these are mostly low-income communities. Lately, the fossil fuel industry, you may have noticed, is starting to circle the drain. Boo-hoo. ExxonMobil lost $355 million in its chemical business, which is mostly plastics, in the last quarter of 2019. Shell lost a similar amount of money. So the future of overproducing plastics is very much linked to whether this new generation of facilities are built called ethane cracker plants. There's a very good report out by Center for International Environmental Law, Plastics and Climate Change, and also Yale 360 has a shorter version. But keep your eye on this issue, and another reason why we really need Congress not to bail out the fossil fuel industry. There was also a terrific article just last week in Time magazine. Will coronavirus be the death or salvation of big plastic? That ran on May 4th. I'm concerned that a lot of people don't know about ethane crackers, and I need to describe it shorter. It's a long story. Ethane crackers, it's not a good story.
Judith, thank you so much. And I think it really highlights that as much as this film showed us so many concerning aspects of the plastics industry, it didn't even cover all of them and all of the other threats that are out there. I briefly wanted to recognize Delegate Lily Chi, who joined, and we're thankful to have former Delegate Andrew Casserly, now Special Advisor to Governor Hogan, for joining us tonight. So thank you to both of you for being on, and I'll be turning it back to Martha.
Okay, well, there's a lot we can do in our own lives to try to reduce our use of single-use plastic, but there's a much bigger picture here, and much of it has to be addressed by changing incentives and regulation, and that depends on legislation. So we're really grateful to have so many legislators on the call tonight. The panelists have been spectacular. They kindly provided us with a list of resources. Lindsay, could you put those up? This is going to be a page, but we're going to send this out to everybody. We have websites. You can scroll down a little bit. We have websites. We have films and videos, webinars, sample legislation. There you go. Sample legislation, articles and major reports. It's much too much to get into this conversation, but we're going to put this on our website along with the recording of this meeting for all to have, and we'll send to everybody who registered, we'll send this list of resources. Josh?
Yeah, and so I just want to give a special thanks to everybody who made this possible, to all of the panelists, to Lindsay Mendelson, who has been working the tech on the backside, and a very special thanks to Martha Ainsworth and the Sierra Club Zero Waste Committee for initiating this. Even when I said, wow, you think you can really get that many legislators on a webinar like this? Well, it's my job to believe in what is possible, and Martha, you made it happen, so thank you to your team. Just to let everybody know that if you were not able to view the film yet, please do. It is phenomenal. And you have the link in your inbox, and it looks like it is good until midnight tonight. And this is a film that's only by special link at this point, so do take advantage of that and watch the film. And please find a way to get involved. Thank you for inviting me to join you tonight, Martha, and I'll turn it back to you for the close.
Yeah, I just like to add a special mention for Pat Hersey. She's the leader of Less Plastic Please in Howard County, and it was her idea to arrange this special viewing for legislators, but we didn't have time during the General Assembly. She did all of the arrangements to procure the film, and we thank her. And then finally, thanks also to the Maryland Sierra Club Zero Waste team. They're members who are volunteers from counties all over the state, and they followed up. We have a lot of county officials on this call too, and local mayors and so forth. So thank you very much to the Zero Waste team. You may not have seen the Zero Waste team yet, but you can be sure you'll see them soon testifying at state and local hearings and engaging the public on how to achieve zero waste and turn off the spigot of single-use plastic. Thanks to all of you, and stay safe.